Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, the Joe Miller Show. We're very honored to have online with us Congressman Bridenstine. He is a representative, congressman from Oklahoma's 1st District, first elected in 2012. He has been fighting the good fight in the Congress against the establishment, the leadership that's selling the country out. Congressman Bridenstine, welcome to the Joe Miller Show.
Thanks, Joe. It's good to be with you.
So we'll just cut straight to it. We've just got one segment with you. I want to talk a little bit about what is very important to our listeners, and that's the stand against the establishment. We want to thank you for taking a stand against Boehner in that election contest a few weeks ago. Have you paid the price for that?
Well, at this point, it doesn't look like there's going to be retribution beyond the two that were kicked off the Rules Committee, and of course that was done immediately following the votes, and there were a number of members of Congress that made it clear that that was unacceptable, and those didn't all include people who voted against the Speaker. What I would say is that, members of Congress stood up and said, look, there can be no retribution. You can't punish people for voting their conscience, and that's ultimately what we did. And just to be clear, the reason, I voted against the Speaker when I first got here in 2013. And as time went on, we won this huge Republican majority. And in 2015, I was actually committed to vote for him because I didn't think there was any possible way to defeat him. But then what happened is, on December 11th, we passed the Cromnibus. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Cromnibus. It was $1.1 trillion. It certainly, they gave us 3 days to read it, and it included a whole bunch of things that most of us should have been uncomfortable with. And when they brought that to the floor for a vote on December 11th, the day before we're all supposed to go home for Christmas, and you still have Harry Reid controlling the Senate, and we're in the middle of a lame duck, which means members are voting, and they're not accountable to their constituents, a lot of them. Because they didn't get reelected or they chose not to run again. And at the end of the day, this whole thing colluded to create very bad legislation. And this actually goes back to September 30th of 2014, when we were going to do a short-term CR at the expiration of the previous CR. And in my estimation at that time, we should have done a short-term CR to get us to January or February when we knew we'd have a Republican Senate. And instead, we did a short-term CR that got us to December 11th, which was in the middle of the lame duck. You had members not coming back. You had Harry Reid still in control of the Senate, and it was the day before Christmas when it was going to expire. So the whole thing colluded. I could have told you on September 30th it was going to be bad. Whatever happened on December 11th was going to be bad. It was bad. And at that point, I committed to vote against the Speaker. And I went public with it. I didn't hold it back. I was very open and honest about it, and nobody could say that it was a surprise.
Well, I got to tell you, you're with a majority of conservatives across the country. That's one of the amazing things about just having 25 votes against the Speaker, when all the polling data I've seen suggests that a majority of Republicans across the country were opposed to his reelection. But now that we have a majority in the Senate, you would think things would be better. But it appears, based upon the DHS funding that went through that allowed President Obama's illegal amnesty to also be funded, that maybe things aren't turning out the way that Americans expected when they gave that wave election over to the Republicans in November.
Yeah, and that's been a big issue because, when we did the Cromnibus back on December 11th of 2014, they withheld Department of Homeland Security appropriations so that it wasn't funded for the entire fiscal year. It was only funded through February 28th. And we were told that, we don't want to have this fight right now before Christmas, but on February 28th, we're going to fight tooth and nail against funding the president's unconstitutional executive order. And I want to be clear, and I know, Joe, you are a champion of the Constitution, and everybody that's listening to this radio station understands your knowledge and, of course, your education on the Constitution. What I would say is this fight that we had on February 28th regarding Department of Homeland Security and the president's unconstitutional executive order had really nothing to do with immigration, nothing. It has to do with the Constitution, which in Article 1, Section 8, it enumerates federal power. And right there it says that Congress has the authority to create an uniform rule of naturalization. Congress has that authority. The executive branch does not have that authority, which means when the president takes that authority from Congress and executes it himself, we have an obligation to rein him in. Well, what is our constitutional tool to rein in this very aggressive, liberal, activist president? Well, we have the power of the purse. So if he's going to take power from us, we have to take it back. How do you take it back? Well, we use the power of the purse. That's why February 28th was so important with the Department of Homeland Security appropriation, because we had an opportunity, and we failed. We had an opportunity to not fund this president's illegal executive order, and we failed. Now, I will tell you, they wanted to do a short-term CR for DHS so that we'd have 3 more weeks to do messaging. Look, we had months to do messaging, and we didn't. And of course, they didn't do messaging because they didn't want to carry that message. And so then we come to February 28th. They said, well, we need another 3 weeks. Well, the reality is they just didn't want to have that fight when Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking on the floor of the House. So this was the challenge and the dilemma. And our position was, we're not going to fund the president's unconstitutional executive order for the rest of the fiscal year. We're also not going to fund it for 3 weeks. And then they came back with a very short-term CR for Homeland Security that would be 1 week. And a lot of us, that's after we killed it for 3 weeks on the floor of the House, which was very awkward. You could hear a pin drop in there as they were trying to, extract the votes from members of Congress. But then they come back that night with a 1 week CR for Homeland Security that funded the president's executive order. And a lot of us were scratching our heads. If we're not going to fund it for 3 weeks, why would we fund it for 1 week? This doesn't make sense. And what we didn't know at the time was that there was a deal with Pelosi where, with that 1 week CR, we would also ask for a conference with the Senate, which just means that, the Homeland Security for the House and Homeland Security appropriations for the Senate, they don't match. So we're just going to appoint conferees from both bodies to come together and work out a solution. But if the Senate rejects a conference, which they did, they rejected it immediately, that triggers a rule that says any member of the House can bring up the DHS appropriation bill from the Senate. And the Senate passed DHS appropriations clean. In other words, it funded the president's executive order. So when we did the 1 week CR, and Nancy Pelosi and President Obama, they all whipped for it. We did a 1 week CR. We requested the conference with the Senate. The Senate rejected the conference, and then it comes back to the House. Anybody can stand up and request to pass the Senate bill, which funded the president's executive order, and they brought that to the floor, and they passed it with all Democrats and only a handful of Republicans. It was egregious.
Yeah, and so more of that's going to continue in the future. What's the strategy to rein in the Speaker and the others that are pushing basically the establishment's agenda, which in part, of course, executes what the president wants as well? What are you guys going to do?
Well, look, there are a number of strong conservatives that are standing up and saying, look, we cannot continue going down this path. And the American people are fed up with it. I know you mentioned earlier that, the Speaker, when you look at the polling, he's not popular across the country. Well, if you come from the 1st District of Oklahoma, it's even more conservative than the rest of the country.
Right.
And they're not conservative in the sense that they believe in conservative philosophy necessarily. They just believe in the rule of law. They believe in the Constitution. And they want people to stand up and say, look, the president is out of control. And so, look, we're going to continue, highlighting these. Look, I'm talking on your radio show right now, and I'm continuing to tell people what is happening regarding the House of Representatives. It is failing us right now, and we've got to do something to change the direction. I don't have an answer for you what that ultimately might look like, but I can tell you the American people are with the few of us here in Washington, D.C. that are actually standing for the Constitution, regardless of the political consequences. And
go ahead.
And
we have your back. I mean, we want leaders like you to stand up and confront this lawlessness and to confront the co-option that goes on in the Republican Party. We see this even in Alaska, a microcosm, our legislature, where the establishment co-ops the conservative vote, which represents the majority of the people, and yet always it seems that the will of the people is trounced, the rule of law is trounced. We got to put a stop to it.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and I've only been in Congress now for 2 years and a couple of months. So what I have seen is that the power structures that exist always favor the status quo, and that's why the American people expect something, they never get it, and then they get mad at their legislature. The status quo says, look, if you want to raise money in Washington, D.C., if you want to get money from lobbyists, if you want to get money from political action committees, if you want to get money from the Republican Party, then you have to go along with whatever the status quo is. If you want to chair a committee or if you want to chair a subcommittee, if you want to get your name on a bill, you have to go along with the status quo. And, of course, that's why members of Congress come here and they act in a way that's different than they campaigned. Their constituents get upset, but now they've got a whole host of money to trick their constituents into thinking they're actually doing the right thing. And so this is the dilemma that we face. And we've got to elect folks that are willing to stand up for the Constitution.
Congressman Bridenstine, a champion of the Constitution, a champion for the people, standing up against the corrupt party leadership, doing everything he can to get the nation back on track and to rein in Obama. Thank you, Congressman, for being on the show. Our prayers will be with you. Keep up the fight. Stay with us at the Joe Miller Show. Be back in just a few minutes.